Hello and welcome back to History of Philosophy. This week in Module 6, we're going to be looking at social contract theories, in particular those that belong to Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. The first thing we typically do is try to find a working definition for ourselves so that we can sort of move into the material with at least an idea in mind as to what it is we're talking about at the very least. So for us, the definition of a social contract, or what used to be called a compact, is a voluntarily, legally consensual agreement among individuals by which, according to the various theories of Hobbes, Locke, or Rousseau, organized society is brought into being and invested with the right to secure mutual protection and welfare, as well as to regulate the legal relations among its members. So even in a state of nature, where everyone belongs to one form or another of a community, the community of humankind even, when a person unites with others to form a commonwealth and then eventually a political society, then that move is considered one of incorporation. So let's go back one more time and have a look at it, see if we can pick out some of the key words here. And really the key one is in the first sentence, voluntary. So a social contract is a voluntary, legally consensual agreement. So it is an agreement amongst individuals that we voluntarily come together to form this compact, and that compact becomes the foundation of a political society. And that's essentially how it works. Now, what is it there to do? Well, it's there to secure the rights of individuals, secure mutual protection and mutual welfare, as well as regulate the legal relations among its members. This would be signing contracts, for example, which is why it's called a social contract. But a social contract is supported and it's founded upon a legal system that then inherently protects the rights of citizens. And of course, we all know, depending on who the citizen is, some of those rights extend in different ways. So the social contract is not perfect. It's far from perfect. It's the best that we have. But at least in theory, if it were to work to the best of our advantages, it would secure the rights for mutual protection and welfare and also protect legal relations. Because at the end of the day, if you're going to sign a contract to lease an apartment from someone, you want to make sure that when you come back from school that day, the apartment's still there and it's yours and the locks haven't been changed. So you agree to pay the landlord a certain amount of money or some corporation a certain amount of money, and in return, they let you live in that place. That's a contract that's legally binding, and a key word here, legally binding, because there is a legal system that protects both you and the landlord. So all those things we need to keep in mind when we're talking about a social contract. Now, the first person that comes along is Thomas Hobbes. Thomas Hobbes is more of a hardliner when we compare him to Locke and Rousseau. And let's kind of look into the reasons why I'm saying that. Okay, because all three of them are looking to create a social contract. That in itself is a good thing. So Hobbes argued that individuals had a drive for self-preservation, and that's a good thing. Now, that caused them to leave their state of nature to form a social compact, and they leave the state of nature because it is an otherwise nasty, terrible, dangerous kind of place to be. And again, different thinkers had different versions of the state of nature, but Hobbes had a rather negative view of the state of nature and wanted people to basically abandon it completely and move into the social contract that would transfer their individual rights to protect themselves, to attack if they are attacked upon, to protect their stuff. And Hobbes wanted the individuals that entered into that social contract to transfer those kinds of rights to a third party, in this case to a sovereign power that could in turn protect them. So what makes Hobbes a bit more of a hardliner is because he decided that the monarchy was the best system that was available to give us that kind of protection. Locke and Rousseau, by the same token, still looks for protection, but one that can be rejected if that sovereign power is not protecting us to the degree that we should be, or is doing things in our best interest. If there is a kind of a deviation between what the body politic needs and wishes and what government is doing, then we have some issues. But Hobbes believed that we should enter into a social contract because the state of nature is such a nasty place to be, and we transfer those individual rights that exist by nature in the state of nature to a sovereign power. And that's really self-protection as well. So self-preservation is one, but self-protection is the other. So in Leviathan, which is Hobbes' big book written in 1651, it's there he outlines how individuals agree to give up these rights to protect themselves, self-preservation, and also to govern themselves, because the state of nature is just not individual people. It's small communities of families, and those families have already a head of one sort or another. They have a father figure or a male leader of the household. So the notion of giving up a certain amount of individual rights already exists in the family, already exists in the community. So the state of nature that is defined by Hobbes is almost a fiction, because you would have to go back many thousands of years to find the kind of world that Hobbes is talking about. Now, that's not super important. It's worth knowing, but it's not as important as why Hobbes has set up this fiction or this hypothesis in order for people to move away from that and towards a social contract. And he says individuals should agree to give up the rights to govern themselves to a king. Now, governing themselves also means protecting themselves. And Hobbes thinks that we should give that up to a king or to some monarch, some authority figure, on the condition, and this is the key phrase here, on the condition that everyone else do the same. It isn't just some people that give up their rights. Everyone that enters into that society, into that community, will give up those rights to protect themselves, self-preservation, self-governing, and we give them over to a monarch, and in exchange, we get protection. So it's kind of a really highfalutin extortion racket. You do something for me and I'll do something for you. We may not exchange money, but we do in the form of taxes, but I digress. So as a result, Hobbes is able to create this new society that has the power to punish those who transgress that agreement. So Hobbes, now remember Locke and Rousseau as well, all three of them believe that this new society should be governed by some kind of power, aristocratic, monarchical, democratic, whatever, that still reserves the power to punish those who transgress the agreement. So if we have given up the right to protect ourselves and we decide to kill someone and we engage in the act of murder, according to all three thinkers, we should lose our lives. So no matter who it is we're talking about, this new society must have the power to punish those who transgress the agreement, who steal, who rape and pillage, who commit treason, who murder. So the society, the system, should reserve the right to terrify its citizens into obedience. So that's a tall order. Now, we talked about Descartes last week and this kind of mechanistic view of the world, and we see the same thing again with Hobbes, because he's writing in England, but he's using the same sort of model, this kind of scientific cause and effect mechanistic model, and he does it by doing the following. Hobbes argues that human beings are individualistic by nature and to further their own interest by any means necessary. So we are bordering on narcissistic. We are all about self-preservation. We wish to do whatever we can to protect ourselves. And in the state of nature, all we have is stuff. When we enter into a contract, our stuff becomes property. And property now can be deemed having either a deed or a lease or some kind of legal document that says, this belongs to me. So Hobbes realizes, as a kind of proto-psychologist, we'll say, because psychology is not even on the table, not for actually another couple of hundred years. But Hobbes is remarkable in understanding the nature of human beings. And he says, look, human beings are individualistic by nature, right? We'll do whatever we can to further our interests. Now, we do that, but we also know that so does everyone else. So we fear one another, right? So there's a kind of weird balance in the state of nature between knowing that I can do whatever I want, but so can someone else. So we fear one another. Now, there's this mutual ability to hurt and kill one another, which is very true. There's also this sort of false notion that we are strong, because even if you have a group of 3 or 4 people or a family that is going to fight to regain something you may have lost, if the next family you're fighting with is twice the size, chances are you're going to lose. So Hobbes understood this. He understood the psychology of human beings. And I think this is why his ability to convince individuals that the social contract is a good idea was so effective. He understood the psychology of people. They were individualistic by nature, but we're not so stupid that we don't realize that others also share the same potential, right? The same ability to covet something that may belong to us, or maybe something that we wanted, but now we can't have it because someone else took it. So the most common reason why individuals desire to hurt each other is when the individual desire is the same thing. Everybody may want to go after a piece of land at the top of a mountain that has a beautiful view, or an apple orchard, or coveting a stray cow somewhere. Again, we're talking the state of nature, not downtown London here. But the most common reason why individuals would want to engage in this individualistic behavior and yet fear that in others is when we're all trying to covet the same thing, because we can't divide it up. An apple orchard is an apple orchard, or a single apple tree is just a single one. We can't chop it up into little bits and say everybody gets their share. Unfortunately, only one person gets their share at that moment. And then after that, well, there could be a struggle for that piece of arable land, or that the cow, or whatever it may be. Therein lies the problem in the state of nature. People are absolutely free, but so is everyone else. You and I are free, but so is everyone else. So we may be individualistic by nature, but we know that everyone else is, and that causes a tremendous amount of fear. So if that's the case, the first foundation of natural right is the ability to protect one's life and one's property. And this is what Hobbes is writing about when he says the state of nature is a nasty place, pretty scary, and if you can engage with me and come along and agree to the social contract, I will be able to protect you. So he writes, nature gives everyone a right to all, that is to possess, use, and enjoy all that they want or can get. However, because individuals have a right to all things, it's like having no right at all. It becomes a war of all against all. So in this war of all against all, where we may be individualistic and we can grab whatever we want, but so can everyone else, life can become very, very dangerous. So that desire that we have for self-preservation, we don't want to be hurt and killed in some violent way, that desire for self-preservation is what Hobbes calls a law of nature. And the law of nature should become the vehicle by which we think, well, if I want to preserve my selfhood and my family and my stuff, then perhaps peace is something I should go after. So the goal of peace requires us to, again, give up certain rights, to retaliate, to become a vigilante, to engage randomly in acts of murder. No, we can't. We have to give up those rights. So self-preservation also indicates and should tell us pretty clearly that we do not have the right to harm others and kill others unless it's in self-defense. And that, of course, is written into the law, even in the case of murder. There is first degree, second degree, manslaughter, accidental death, a whole range of, it's not even a sliding scale, but it's a range of viewpoints in terms of a particular act that ended the life of another person. So the legal system is still somewhat nuanced a little bit, but Hobbes is going, regardless of this, I know that in that state of nature, it's a war of all against all. And the law of nature that I can identify in human beings, their deepest desires, is that desire for self-preservation. And so if you can give up the right to murder other people, because in that way you know that you're less likely to be murdered by someone, that degree of self-preservation is kept intact. And that is also the means by which we realize, well, no, if I want to protect myself, that doesn't give me the right to go and harm someone else. So clearly, it's a psychological sort of disposition that Hobbes is talking about, where we may be happy in that social contract because not only do we preserve ourselves and our family and our property now, but there is also the likelihood that it is much less likely to happen that we will be harmed in some way. So Hobbes looks at the law this way. He says, okay, there's 4 things. So look at the first 2 here. The law of nature states that peace should be sought after as much as possible. And wherever it may be found, and if it cannot be found, that we are allowed to protect ourselves against the inevitability of war. Now, that could be war within and war without, right, by another country. And Hobbes saw England split in half during a civil war in the 1600s. Now, he was smart. He left and lived in France during that time. But when he came back to England, he realized that never again would I ever want to see this happen. Because the actual war, the Civil War, was based partly on religious differences, but also on political differences and skirmishes and misunderstandings of one sort or another. And this is why Hobbes is such by comparison, a hardliner, right? By comparison to Locke and Rousseau. He's such a hardliner because he wanted to make absolutely sure that civil war would never happen again in England, or in fact anywhere else for that matter. And of course, you can imagine the historical context in which these ideas are being developed and presented is following years and years of religious wars. So to have a secular entity, a monarchy, for example, be the absolute ruler, from our perspective in 2022, may appear harsh, but we can at least understand why Hobbes wanted this. Because he had seen a civil war with his own eyes that tore a country apart. So he wanted an absolute power, an absolute monarchy. And even during Hobbes' lifetime, King Charles I was beheaded to be replaced by Oliver Cromwell, who brought in an absolute draconian republic. Everybody was miserable. The arts were gone. Theater was gone. Everyone was miserable. They hated it. And eventually, Charles II, who was smart enough to take off to Scotland, came back, overthrew Cromwell, and got him beheaded, and everything was okay. Hobbes wanted to make sure this never happened again. So he said, no matter what, peace is to be sought after. And if we can't, we need to be able to protect ourselves, right, against someone that wants to commit the act of war against us. So first is peace is to be sought after. 2, the rights of all individuals to all things should be abolished. And what that means is not the fact that we can't buy something, but the fact that this notion of all individuals have a right to all things. Well, no, because if someone can purchase something or perhaps put a fence around it, which is what Locke argues later on, if we can remove the fact that everything is up for grabs, the likelihood of maintaining peace is a lot greater. So the right of all individuals to all things ought to be abolished, and other rights ought to be transferred or relinquished. So the right of individuals to simply run out and grab something and covet, right? That's what that means, to covet something. That should be put aside. This is not something we want to bring from the state of nature into the social contract, because that is what made the state of nature so horrible. 3, people should seek peace by joining together and agreeing to transfer some of those rights to a common power. This is what I mentioned before. This idea of transferring the rights to protect oneself, to retaliate, to murder through protection. Those things need to be either given up altogether or transferred to a common power. In the case of Hobbes, to a monarchy. Let the monarchy put someone else to death who has committed murder. That's not your job. Your job is to live in the society, follow the rules, and be happy. And 4th, the transfer that is done to a particular group is called a council. The transfer is called a union, and the result is called a civil society. So the end result is we have a civil society in which people can exchange goods and services. This is again should begin to sound like the beginnings of economics, because economics can only work if there's a relationship between the buyer and seller, the owner and the worker. Any of these relationships that involve doing something for someone else, a good or a service, needs to be contractual. So the transfer that is done to create all of this, to create a civil society upon which economics is based, all stems from us agreeing that we are going to trust each other. And the notion of trust is absolutely crucial in society. Without trust, we end up not living in a society that is beneficial to us. We're always fearful that someone's lying to us. We're always fearful that anytime we enter into an agreement with someone, they could be lying to us and take our money and never, we never see them again. We hear all the time on the news or in the news of people who are basically defrauded of money. People putting up $150,000, $200,000 to build a new home. The contractor just disappears, gone. Well, the person that lost the money had trusted that contractor. So it happens quite often still today. Even though we have laws against it, people still try to do it because they think they can get away with it. Now, the other important book by Hobbes is The Elements of Law, Natural and Political, and it is sort of a continuation of the ideas originally presented in the Leviathan. And this is one that came out shortly after 1640. And it too does the same sort of thing. It tries to persuade the reader through, of course, persuasion and political engagement to buy into the idea of a social contract. And this particular book doesn't enter into the conversation from a psychological point of view, but from a kind of legal point of view, but it still combines both of them. So Hobbes is trying to create this sort of logical or mechanistic demonstration of politics, especially in terms of cause and effect. Cause, if you give up those rights, the effect will be protection. And looked at very basically, very logically, very rationally. And the end result is to allow society to grow and develop on a secular basis, not on a sacred basis. So using science and reason, much like Francis Bacon and Descartes had from last week, Hobbes is kind of doing the same thing. But now he's applying it to political structures, right? Civil society and to society in general. So there's a kind of scientific aspiration in the work, and the scientific aspiration sort of underpins the political ambitions that Hobbes has. And Hobbes really works hard to try to persuade the reader to adopt these ideas that he presents regarding law and policy. And he does it in a very logical and scientific manner. And again, using this mechanistic causal model, right? Cause and effect. If you do this, you shall receive that. And it is pretty straightforward, and it is still a very remarkable book. Now, I mentioned a moment ago that Leviathan sort of works on the psychology of human beings. This one more kind of on a reasonable, rational, persuasive argument on politics. And yet still, those two parts are there because Locke really thought, or never met the man, but I think he felt that combining these two to still talk about human nature and the way in which we see the world and the way we see ourselves would really underpin and hinge very nicely together his other ideas about government and politics. So he wanted to underpin a political argument using psychology. And this is something that really makes Hobbes a different kind of thinker. The fact that he knew some of the weaknesses of human nature, and whether you want to use the word exploit, but he did kind of exploit those preconditions, those characteristics of human nature in order to really make his logical causal presentation of politics that much more compelling, right? And that much more persuasive. So he goes back again, and this is why I say that the Leviathan and Elements of Law really sort of work well together, because they simply develop the same argument, but from a slightly different perspective. And he says the following, right? On the section regarding human nature, he develops two main arguments. The first one, and this is not a very flattering thing about us, is that we tend by nature to be offensive to one another. We're insatiable, vain, narcissistic, to the point of pride and madness. And it is for this reason that Hobbes also is arguing in favor of the monarchy, because the democratic system, and again, he doesn't talk about democracy. This is not something that occurs until much later with Locke's work, probably about 25 years later. So Hobbes is already sort of preempting the idea of voting for someone, because Hobbes believed that most politicians are just full of vanity and pride. They just want to be elected because they want to be popular. And Hobbes thought that was one of the worst reasons to elect anyone. So, number one, human beings are by nature offensive to one another. They're vain and insatiable and narcissistic and filled with pride. And that notion of pride, vote for me because, well, I need to know that I'm popular and loved. Well, Hobbes thought that pride and democracy were completely incompatible. And we can see how certain people are elected, and they are clearly from the first day so utterly incapable of governing that you just want to get rid of them as soon as possible. Now imagine those people filled with hubris and pride in charge until they die or you die, right? That would be the worst. So Hobbes thought that kings were at least reasonable enough creatures to know better. And so there's this weird kind of argument that preempts democracy and the democratic structure of electing officials, when Hobbes says, no, generally speaking, people who gravitate towards this kind of behavior are themselves vain. And that's not a new argument. Plato said the same thing. Writing in the Republic, he said essentially the same thing, that the whole notion of insatiable pride and vanity, that's what motivates people to be politicians, not their ability to be good governors. They just want to be popular. They want to be loved. So that is not a good thing in terms of our human behavior. So that's the first one. The second one is that there's two elements in nature, the fear of violent death and reason, that human beings can learn from. And those are two extremes. On the one hand, there's the fear of violent death, self-preservation taken to the max. The worst thing for someone living in a state of nature is to suffer a violent death. And this is something that would happen quite often. But there's also this other gift, right? This gift that Hobbes gives the individuals who live in a state of nature, which is reason. So he says all of these things, no matter what, now how offensive we are to each other, how vain we are, how much we're worried about, preserving ourselves at the cost of everybody else. We have this little glimmer of hope, this light of reason, as Locke would call it later on, this light of reason, which is the key that we use to finally realize, no matter what, that state of nature is a bad place. That social contract is starting to sound much, much better. So if we can overcome this mutual offensiveness that we have to one another, then maybe using reason and logic and rationality and just general common sense, we can agree to the social contract and realize that this is a good thing. So the consequences of this natural offensiveness that we have, because just that's who we are, says, okay, look, the first element is the fear of violent death. And if we can get over that, and we know how to do that, which is to enter into the social contract, there is a less likelihood. It is less likely that we're going to be killed in some violent way or die in some violent way. We may be lucky enough to just die of old age, which would be an absolute miracle back then. So there has to be something that will counter this fear of violent death. And again, using reason, Hobbes says, okay, look, individuals are egotistic beings, and we want to make sure that we are aware of that because it seems to motivate us more so than not, and for better or worse. It says, okay, look, violent death, murder, it's a horrible evil, and that can happen to anyone else. But in a state of nature, it's much more likely to happen because there are no checks and balances, no safety nets. There's nothing to stop another person from harming you or killing you to covet something that belongs to you. So violent death or murder is one of the greatest evils that befalls human beings, but there is a way around it. And the way around it is to enter into and agree to the social contract. And the way in which we do it is by reminding ourselves that we still have a degree of reason. And that reason gives human beings the means acquired to avoid what we fear the most, which is violent death. We all know we're going to die at some point, but we want to die in the most pleasant fashion of old age, in a bed, surrounded by our friends and family. But in the state of nature, we could be killed at any time over any crazy reason, any really useless reason. That's what makes the state of nature so dangerous. So by entering into an agreement, and we think about it and we are reasonable about it, and he says, yeah, if I enter into this agreement, I will be protected and less likely to be killed, not because I have security guards, but because I live in a society with laws and regulations that the person that might be harming me would hopefully think twice about following through with their urges, their desires. So it is a view of human nature that is a little bit bleak, but it's not hopeless, because Hobbes at least gives us the belief that we will use reason properly, that we will think about these things and think, okay, look, those laws of nature that are there, self-preservation, that's what we want to import and safeguard in the social contract, not our ability to murder one another. And so the only way to achieve that is making individuals understand that those laws are beneficial to us, beneficial to anyone that lives in that particular society. So, in wrapping up the first part here, what all of this means, it means that individuals are miserable in a state of nature because there is no real notion of possessions. You simply have your stuff that you need to protect, and you can protect it any which way you want. But even if you're a big, strong guy, what if there are 10 big, strong guys that show up? They'll take your stuff. So individuals are miserable in a state of nature because they fear violent death, and also because there's a right to all things. So if we can mutually accept that is a bad thing, because anybody can harm us and take our stuff, then perhaps we can overcome that miserable state. And we do it through that mutual agreement called the social contract. So individuals can escape the misery of the state of nature by agreeing to accept obligations that, restrict, yes, their natural right to all things, including the right to harm another person if you think that they have harmed you. So it is a way to look at the world in such a manner that you use reason and rationality and logic and a mechanistic view of the world to say, if I give up this, I will get that in return. If I give up my right to harm someone else just because I feel like it, in exchange, I will be protected by the monarchy, and at the same time, others who live under the same society will think that they too have to follow the same rules and regulations, because remember, if you do harm someone, you could pay with your own life. So you want to be really careful as to what you're going to do when you live in that society. So that's essentially Thomas Hobbes. Now, we're going to finish up here with Locke and Rousseau. There's a fair amount of overlap between these two thinkers because Rousseau was greatly influenced by Locke. But let's take a look at Locke's two treatises of government. As you can see, written 30 years later. So Locke outlines a much more civilized society based on natural rights and a social contract theory. And for Locke, a natural right, or what he calls a natural law, is one that a person has simply by virtue of being a human being. Not an animal, not a plant, but a human being. That we have these innate qualities, and these would be the pursuit of life, health, liberty, possessions, and those natural laws become the foundation that originally existed in the state of nature and now transferred and protected into the social contract. So we have a natural law, which is what defines us as human beings, pursuit of health, happiness, and so on, and liberty. And then there is, once we enter into the social contract, what's called a social right, right? So we move from a natural right in the state of nature to a social right in the social contract, or what's also called a positive law. And that's like a kind of utilitarian right that is not intrinsic to us as human beings, but are or is to any kind of social and legal system. So when we talk about positive laws, these are laws that have been posited by an individual or posited by a group of individuals. So they go above and beyond the natural laws. And if the positive law is a good one, it bases and builds its existence and its reason for being on the natural laws which are already there. So any laws that allow for the pursuit of life, health, liberty, possessions are good. They may be positive laws, but they're good because they allow these natural laws that already existed in the state of nature to continue to exist. The difference is that social and legal system protects it. So if we were to be visual about what Locke's social contract looks like, it would look something like this. So we have on the left-hand side, right, equal rights of life, liberty, and so on. So we the people. So we have a sense of property because we have a sense of selfhood. We are reasonable people. We understand the notion of liberty and how it's contingent upon not only our lives, but allowing other people to live as well. So what we do is we as individuals transfer that power to pursue these natural rights into an executive or legal system, and all of the inconveniences of the state of nature, which would be finding someone to talk to resolve differences that have to do with, someone stealing someone else's stuff, or someone at the worst case scenario murdering someone else. We the people transfer that power to do it ourselves to a third party. So we give that over to the third party. So inconveniences, which is a word that Locke uses, the inability to resolve an issue is really what it means. And this is from the line, civil government is the proper remedy for the inconveniences of the state of nature. It's a very sort of tidy way of saying all the messiness that surrounds an act of violence or an act of theft or worse, some power grab of some kind or another. But all those inconveniences are brought into the executive branch, which is the political, or the judge, which is the legal part. And in exchange, and you see on the bottom half here, those individuals, then give us security and protection. So as we pursue our lives and our liberty and our freedoms, because it's what makes us happy, it's what we consider to be part of our natural rights, and those things are secured and protected by agreeing to allow the executive and the legal system to protect us. So we can still carry on and do the things that we want to do. Okay, so let's sort of take a quick look at some of the phrases and some of the passages from Locke's two treatises of government. And this is one of them here. He says, it is incorrect to assume that all government in the world is that product only of force and violence, that individuals live together by no other rule than that of beasts, where the strongest carries it, and so lays the foundation for perpetual disorder, sedition, and rebellion. That is a pretty different view of the world from Hobbes. Yes, the state of nature can be dangerous, and we have a degree of self-preservation that Locke agrees with. But the difference between Hobbes is that because we already understand the notion of selfhood, life, liberty, protection, property, these things, it's quite different. For Locke, the move from the state of nature to the social contract is an evolutionary step. It's a very natural movement from a situation that has been generally okay, but as inconveniences begin to pile up and our communities in the state of nature become more complex, and the need for legally binding understandings and contracts, those become the inconveniences that the social contract can now take care of. Because if we continue to live in that state of nature, we're always going to be facing the same problem, that there will always be someone stronger than us, more powerful than us, that will threaten us in some way. And Hobbes says, no, we should be entirely reasonable about moving from the state of nature and trying to salvage all the good parts of it, pursuit of life, liberty, and happiness, and bring that into the social contract and therein protect it. Protect those good things that are in the state of nature. So political power, which would be the way by which this can actually come into being, there's three things. There is, first of all, the right of making laws with penalties of death, and consequently of all less penalties. So as much as Hobbes may be a hardliner by comparison, both he and Locke believe that whatever governing body that we agree to transfer our rights to still has the potential to put us to death. If we commit treason, kidnapping, rape and murder, any really capital offense, the government that we live within and under, the legal system, should reserve the right to put us to death. And that will become the motivator for most people to not harm one another, to not kill each other. So both Hobbes and Locke believe that the right of making laws with the penalty of death are absolutely important. The second one is the regulation and preservation of property. So we go in the state of nature from having just stuff which has no price tag or sales receipt or a contract, deed, lease, whatever it may be, all those pieces of paper now in the social contract world become legally binding. So the regulation and preservation of property through legally binding contracts now become a thing that Locke says that the social contract can bring into being and protect. And it protects it through that political power. And three, the defense of the Commonwealth from foreign injury, all that is in the public good. So the Commonwealth, democratically elected, can still do the same thing as the government that is proposed by Hobbes, because it is a defense of the Commonwealth, but it is also one where we can vote them out of office if we're not happy with the work that they're doing. So there is the right of making penalties or right of making laws, some of which will result in the death of the perpetrator, the regulation and preservation of property, and third, the defense of the Commonwealth, for example, in the event of war, that Commonwealth should be allowed to create an army. So Locke writes in trying to identify the difference between a natural right and a social right, he says, I wish to remain alive and free from harm. However, if I commit a capital offense, then I consent to allow the state to take my life or my freedom for the greater good of society. So the penal system, right, the prison system in any given society is one in which we understand that are living under those rules as subjects. When we think about being subjected to something, in this case, we are subjected to a legal system that, depending on where you live, can include at the very least, incarceration, and at the very worst, or at the very most, death, right? Capital punishment. So different countries around the world over the last 100 years have repealed laws regarding capital punishment. We are slightly more enlightened. Is that stopping people from killing one another? Apparently not. And if you look to the U.S., where capital punishment is still used, they have the highest murder rate in the world. I digress, but it's a fact. So what Hobbes is saying here is, I do want to live in this society, but I also know that if I commit a capital offense, that the state can take my freedom and or my life. He continues to talk in two treatises and says, to understand political power and derive it from its original, we must consider what state all men are naturally in, which is a state of perfect freedom, in order their actions and dispose of their possessions as they see fit. So there is a degree of equality, which is a really interesting way to think of equality for Locke in the state of nature. So all, again, it is all men, that's what he says, but all men are in a state of perfect freedom and perfect equality. So Locke, unlike Hobbes, who looks at that as a bad thing, Locke says, no, because we're reasonable people, we think that perfect freedom and equality is a good thing, that we can move about and do whatever we want, and as long as we don't harm other people and we don't end up in some kind of inconvenience, we're okay. So Locke says, let's take those good things out of the state of nature and bring those and entrench those by law and through the legal system. Let's entrench those rights that we have. And that's how we move from a natural right to a social right or to a positive law. Because any law that continues to protect freedom, continues to protect equality, is always a good thing because it's based on a natural inclination that we have. He continues again, in society, individuals are equal before the law, and all power and jurisdiction is reciprocal, that is, without subordination or subjection. However, individuals do not have rights entrenched and protected by law. They are merely equal under the law. And this is what resembles a state of nature. So individuals may be equal in the legal sense, but they're also morally bound to one another. And Locke believed that the state of nature contained many of these same elements that are also present in the social contract. This is why it's such a natural evolutionary step. The inconvenience has become too much, so that individuals living in a state of nature realize that, yes, we need to move from this into that. Move from this state of nature, which is becoming more and more difficult to maintain a level of freedom and liberty because there's maybe too many of us, or maybe there's less and less arable land, and there could be some fighting and skirmishes going on. We need to create a kind of social, political, and legal system that will entrench these good things, right? Pursuit of liberty, equality, freedom, all these things that are good. And we do it in a way that all of us, by entering into the contract, are all equal under the law. Now, once again, this is an ideal version of it. We know that very, very rich people don't tend to spend a whole lot of time in jail. They rarely do. They're rarely on death row in the U.S. Money can buy you freedom, and that's the unfortunate part of it. So these are ideal situations. But what Locke is saying is we are all, or should all, be equal under the law. So we are subjects under the law, and it doesn't matter who we are and how allegedly wealthy we are. We should be considered under the same category as human beings. So he continues, though the state of nature may not be a state of liberty, may be a state of liberty and freedom, it's not yet a state of license, because we don't have official permission to do certain things. And what he means by that is the state of nature has a law of nature to govern it, and it applies to everyone. And so what we need to do is figure out a way in which that state of liberty, which is a good thing, how can we protect it? We can do so by creating a license, or a way in which this can go about. And the way in which we can go about doing these things is creating a legal system that maximizes freedom, right? That maximizes liberty. That doesn't mean it legalizes murder. Absolutely not. But what it does is it gives people the leeway to do the things that allows them to be happy. And so if that is the case, then human reason teaches us that because we are equal and independent, that perhaps we shouldn't harm each other. We don't need to harm one another, because that pursuit of life and liberty and possessions and happiness and freedom and all these things are what all of us yearn for. All of us wish we can do, wish we could do. And so if that's the case, then all of us should be allowed to practice these particular things, because they are also protected under law. But that doesn't mean you can randomly start punching people, because that is against the law. Because in terms of health, that's kind of scary. It's not a good thing. In terms of liberty, that becomes a frightful way to live. So individuals can act freely in a society, but they are morally bound to one another. They are morally, we are morally asked to respect one another. Without that, it's not going to work. Now, finally, when we talk about the way in which the state of nature was unable to deal with the inconveniences of people misbehaving, Locke says, in a state of nature, one man may overpower another in order to seek retribution, and as far as calm reason and conscience dictates, what is proportionate to a transgression. This is the famous an eye for an eye. So clearly, someone caught, jaywalking would not be hung, at dawn the next day. But someone who murders another person likely will be. So retribution and transgressions should be proportional. And this is a really interesting idea. It's quite modern, because retribution is really the only time when someone may wish to harm another person in the form of punishment. So Locke's position, like Locke's idea, is empirical, and it's also rational. So he does it in this way. If you are caught doing something that is considered a capital offense, and you have transgressed this very important law, you should be put to death. At the time Locke was living, when someone was put to death, they were often done, it was done very publicly. There was a public square where there was either a guillotine or, hangman's noose or whatever. So Locke's position regarding capital punishment is both empirical, because you could see it, right, with your senses, but it was also rational, because again, it used a very specific and clear causal relationship between doing something and the resulting actions. If I murder someone, I will be put to death. You can't get more causal than that. So Locke's position is empirical. We see the state at work putting someone to death, but it's also rational. It's derived from reason. So there's a very mechanistic view of actions and consequences. So from these two distinctive rights, the one for punishment and the other for retribution, only the injured party should be involved, and whatever legal magistrates are involved, they should have the consensual right to punish the transgressor. It isn't up to us. This is what we have given up. Now, people still engage in vigilante behavior and retribution, and it does happen. At no point does anyone ever think that with a social contract that all crime is gone. Absolutely not. The U.S., for example, is one of the most complex prison systems anywhere in the world, and yet they are the ones that followed Locke almost to the letter. Pursuit of freedom, happiness, liberty, and yet they have a very comprehensive prison system. So go figure. So Locke writes, every man has a power to punish the crime, to prevent its being committed again, by the right he has to preserving all mankind and doing all reasonable things that he can in order to that end. And that includes putting the murderer to death, or the kidnapper, or the rapist, or the person committing treason. So there is a very clear, mechanistic, causal relationship between actions and consequences, or between a cause and an effect. And so those distinct rights that the society, not us, the society maintains, one for punishment and one for retribution, those two rights we need to live under as subjects. We need to know that those things are there. So, can we still apply the death penalty to punishers for lesser breaches of law? And Locke says, no, absolutely not, because it has to be proportional. So each transgression must be punished to a reasonable degree, and with as much severity as will suffer to make an ill bargain for the offender. So it must be done in such a way that it will be reciprocal and fair and balanced, and that the person that has committed this particular act is going to think twice in the future. Now, if they're put to death, that's not an issue. But if something happens, and if they are committing fraud and they are arrested and they are tried and convicted, well, you put that person away long enough to make them really think about what they've done, with the hope that it won't happen again. Because for Locke, every offense that could be committed in a state of nature must also be recognized and punished in the Commonwealth by the Commonwealth. So that is not a license to murder or kidnap, quite the opposite. That may be something that was possible in a state of nature, maybe without repercussions, quote unquote, but guess what? Whoever you murdered always had a family. And now you're dealing with vengeance and retribution. That is now going to be in the realm of politics and law. So the law will be following through and punishing transgressors, not us. So civil government is the proper remedy for the inconveniences of a state of nature. And this is what he says, which must certainly be great, where men may be judges in their own case, since it is easy to imagine that an individual who purposely harms or injures another will hardly be willing to condemn themselves for it. So clearly the very person that is committing an act should not be the person who decides how to punish that person. It needs to be done by a third party, by a civil government. And those kinds of inconveniences are the ones that are now given over to the legal system and the political system to correct. So a magistrate is legally and politically obligated to uphold the natural rights already granted to individuals as natural laws. So anything that goes against that is something that we need to think seriously about. What laws are going against political freedom or liberty or happiness, pursuit of a better life? All those things, all those laws that work against that are not good laws, and we should allow or have the recourse to question them and possibly throw them out. So as much as Locke may have been a fan or at least a supporter of capital punishment, he also says that yes, it needs to be tempered by retribution, and it needs to be tempered by it being reasonable, right? Because we're not going to put to death someone who does such a harmless offense as jaywalking. That's just not the way a good society functions. But the magistrate is politically obligated to uphold those natural rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness that is already guaranteed to the individual. Okay, so we're going to move very quickly over to Rousseau here. It's already 55 minutes. So in this transition, we hear the essays on the law of nature. This is Locke. He writes that men should keep their compacts or their social contracts is certainly a great and undeniable rule of morality. And in this particular text, much like Locke writes Elements of Law, here we have essays on the law of nature. These also are arguments in assessing and justifying that move from the state of nature to a social contract. So without that natural obligation, it would not be expected that individuals would stand by a compact because he or she has not promised it. There's nothing good in it for them. But if you build that social contract on those natural rights that individuals already feel in the state of nature, then you're more likely to do a better job. So it is the formation of the political or civil society that is usually referred to when we talk about a social contract, right? The term is used. So we can make individual promises, personal contracts, we can sign leases, we can have a deed to a house, and all these legally binding contracts, whatever shape they may take, are all still protected by the legal system under which we live. And this is what is good for Locke. So a compact is where individuals agree together to enter into one community and make one, what he calls a body politic. This is the word that Rousseau also uses. And we are able to move from that state of nature into a civil society. So as we move from Locke to Rousseau, we want to start thinking about some of the terms that Locke is using, the compact, the body politic. But this compact here is a kind of original compact, an original agreement by which every single individual, and remember, everybody needs to buy into it, each individual incorporates with others into one single society and obligations to everyone else within that society. Now, what that means is what we've experienced here over the last 2.5 years. We should be morally obligated to wear a mask, to get a vaccine, to socially distance, because what we are experiencing is not some fight for freedom. It's a public health crisis. And if we are morally connected to one another, then we have a moral imperative to protect others by protecting ourselves. By wearing a mask, then we are not only protecting ourselves, we're protecting others. And so for Locke, that moral imperative, that moral relationship that people have is also very, very important because it is the glue that holds that society together. A society can have all kinds of wonderful laws, but if people lie to each other and don't trust one another, that system, that society, that social system will break down. So we need to make sure that that does not happen. So the final person we want to look at is Rousseau, and he lived in the 1700s. Locke died in 1703, roughly. So Rousseau comes along shortly after, lived a fairly good life. And he was very much influenced by Locke's two treatises of government. And Rousseau's own political philosophy, it influenced the French Enlightenment, partly the radical French Enlightenment as well as the Enlightenment movement in general across Europe. And so Rousseau is considered to be one of several thinkers that set the kind of philosophical and intellectual stage for the French Revolution. So his intellectual contributions really allowed those that were thinking about a new way of life to know what direction to go, right? The French Revolution was an absolutely major upheaval in Western Europe and literally around the world because democratic systems that we know of today are based on that model, the model that came out of the French Revolution, not from ancient Greece. So the French Revolution gave us democratically elected government, the rights of individuals entrenched in law. So Locke only gave us a book. The French Revolution created an actual condition under which these things could be played out. And Rousseau was the French version of Locke that gave the French-speaking population clear ideas as to how this could happen. So he writes in the Social Contract, came out in 1762. So we're talking almost 100 years after the Leviathan. And all of this is going on over about a 150-year period. Many other writers dealing with other issues as well, all of them important. But this book here, there's 4 main sections. The first one is talking about the rightful base for a civil society. The second one, the nature and functions of an effective sovereign body. Book 3 talks about governments, and Book 4 talks about issues concerning forms and organizations of a just society. So again, Rousseau, like Locke, is really concerned with freedom, liberty, equality, and that would make a just society. An unjust one is a society that is a legal system that infringes upon the rights of individuals. Any system that's like that is bound to fail. So we'll go very sort of briefly point form into this particular book. Rousseau's theories look very much like those presented by Locke. We can go through them very quickly here. Individuals originally lived in a state of nature in complete freedom. That sounds like Locke, and not subject to authority. And again, let's keep that conditional, because even in a state of nature, there were families that were run by male households. So right there was a power dynamic. Those individual families lived in small communities or larger communities. So not subject to authority, that should be conditioned as not subject to legal authority. There were different kinds of authorities that were already there. So it's not like people didn't know what a power dynamic was. They knew full well what it was. But what Rousseau's talking about here is subject to a legally entrenched authority, someone that was unquestioned. So that's 1. 2, self-preservation in a state of nature became too difficult, right? Those inconveniences that Locke talked about. So individuals made a pact to forfeit some of their natural liberty to the community in exchange for its protection. Now that part is pretty clearly Hobbes and Locke together. Third one, civil authority arose from what was called a social contract. That is, again, right across the board, all 3 thinkers. And the last one here is a very much Rousseau. Nevertheless, regarding all these things, force did not give a government moral authority. Just because you are forcing someone to behave in a certain way and run counter to their natural rights of freedom, liberty, and equality, just because the government can do it, it does not give them the moral authority to do so. And this was directed to the monarchy that was increasingly horrible to the French population in the mid to late 1700s. So that was not even a veiled threat, but a very directed comment on the French monarchy in France at the time, which is why Rousseau's ideas really took hold in the French population. So the social contract would become the body politic, and individuals living within that body politic would be able to make certain rules and regulations, because it would be individuals that would be speaking on their behalf. And so under this sovereignty that he was talking about, members were called citizens. Under state law, they were subjects, and individuals were subject to the laws and restrictions equally. So there is freedom and equality and liberty in the society, but everyone would have to follow those rules and regulations. There was not a hierarchy of some people are above the law and others are not, although there are many people that think they are, but they are not. And then finally, the sovereign, right, that governing body, may occasionally use force to ensure that individuals follow the general will. Now, here is again a good example where the general will was brought down by government in terms of the pandemic, and I will use that as an example, where there was the decision by public policy defenders that we should be masked, that we should socially distance, and we should get a vaccine. Now, it's not against the law not to get one. It used to be against the law before, right? People were fined for not wearing masks. People were fined for not socially distancing. When the pandemic first hit, it was pretty hardcore. I mean, people were getting fined a lot of money because they were not following the general will. We weren't really sure what was going on. But as time went on and we began to learn more and more about the disease, about COVID-19, we realized that yes, getting a vaccine is probably a good idea. Let's continue to mask when we're in public because it protects us as much as others, right? We're morally obligated to do that. So that is just one example. But the sovereign, according to Rousseau, should be allowed to use some degree of force to follow the general will. Now, what if the general will is, let's kill all people that weren't born here? Clearly, an awful lot of people should stand up and say, absolutely not. This is a horrible idea. But what if the public policy said that's what we should do? What if we should steal from our neighbors? Well, wait a minute. I'm a neighbor to someone else. They're going to steal from me. On and on. Yes, I'm being facetious and really, extreme. But the general will sometimes is favorable, and it should be, because remember, it should be based on the pursuit of life, liberty, equality, and happiness. And if it isn't, we need to really question seriously why that is. So, like Locke, Rousseau presents a social contract also as this natural evolutionary progression, and he asks what makes a social contract necessary, and the answer is essentially the same thing as Locke, that there is a need in the state of nature to protect ourselves. We need to overcome the inconveniences of that state of nature because we have certain material wants and weaknesses. And if we can bring people together and create a society where what we lack, we can get from someone else. And that becomes the foundation in a civil society of the goods and services that we now have today. So an economic system can grow out of that if we bring together people who have wants and needs and weaknesses and desires. And those lacks of one sort or another, those negative positions that people are in, they can be filled, and we can act and live in harmony because suddenly someone who needs a pair of shoes can meet a person that makes shoes. So the goods and services are there. Everybody that needs something can come together, and when we do that, we form an association that is very beneficial to everybody. So it protects and defends all of us, the whole common force, each of the individuals that live within it, whether you're a citizen or a subject. But more so than that, the things that you lack in your life, you can find and have satisfied with other people through the goods and services that they offer. So it becomes a legal foundation, a social foundation, and an economic foundation. Now, what Rousseau is most famous for in his social contract is this very clear definition of the limits of power exercised by the state. This is what made Rousseau's writing so powerful and so relevant to those individuals who are living under French monarchical rule. Because the monarchy, Louis XVI, was just a generally horrible person and became worse as he collected more and more taxes. More and more people were starving, out of work. And Rousseau saw that. He said there should be a clearly defined limit of power exercised by the state. So just because someone is stronger doesn't make them the master unless they can transform that strength into a right and an obedience into a duty. So the monarchy, the governing body, the sovereign, whoever it is, yes, they are powerful. Remember, they can put us to death. But why not use that power and use that power to protect us, to protect our rights? And in turn, just like that causal effect, if we know they protect us, then obviously we will obey what they're asking us to do. But Rousseau goes on, what kind of moral effect would force have as a physical power? And he says, to yield to force would be an act of necessity or prudence, not of free will. Remember how Locke said that we have a moral obligation to one another? Rousseau says, no, we have no moral obligation to a government that basically forces us to do something at gunpoint. When that happens, the notion of free will and choice are gone. You're just doing it because you have no other choice. You simply follow through. And so if citizens need to obey by force, there's no need to obey out of duty, because duty involves a choice to follow or not follow, to act or to not act. And clearly, if these laws are being presented and enforced at gunpoint, then the whole idea of a moral imperative is gone. If we are forced to obey, we are under no obligation to do so. So the notion of being forced to do something is really an idea in Rousseau's work that needed to be clearly stated, because individuals reading the social contract in the 1760s, they would know exactly who Rousseau was talking about. So he felt that individuals reached a point in which the obstacles for self-preservation in the state of nature prevailed over the forces that each individual would have in the state. And again, much like Locke, Rousseau looked at that relationship very, very similarly. So Locke believed that whatever obstacles against self-preservation in the state of nature could be supplanted and corrected and refined in the social contract. So there would be the ability for us to continue to be free and be equal, and that life and liberty and all the rest of it. We can do that because the laws reflect those same desires. And if they don't, then there's something wrong with those laws. So the sum of forces can only arise when several people would come together and form an association that would defend and protect private property, as well as allow each member to obey only themselves. So we are going to follow what we think is important, because we have an understanding of freedom, but knowing full well that our freedom and liberty extends only as far as it begins to threaten someone else. Once our liberty, our actions that we think are free and equal, once they impinge on someone else, then we have a problem. This is why the pandemic is, for some people, been so confusing. If we look at it morally, we can look at our actions. If I wear a mask, then I'm doing it because I'm protecting myself. So I have a degree of self-preservation. Hobbes would like me. But Locke and Rousseau are also asking me to be mindful of the other members of my community. So if there is some push by the public policy planners of the sovereign, or in this case, a democratically elected government, asking me to do something, and if it is to do something that is beneficial to me, then I would follow through and do it. But if it goes against my notion of freedom and liberty, then I would need to question what it is. But a pandemic, right, a public health crisis, is not the same thing as, hey, we want you to go out and randomly murder people, with the following names. That's not what is being asked. And Rousseau is very clear on that there has to be a relationship with each individual where the individuals can make up their minds as to what they personally think liberty and freedom and equality must look like, but keeping in mind the morality of others as well. So alienation, where we give up these freedoms, are made with reservation. We don't give up absolutely everything. We still retain a degree of self-awareness where we are the ones who are able to make a decision to do something and not something else. And again, I keep using the pandemic as an example because it is one that has sorely tested the social contract in all kinds of ways. So finally, what would duty and interest oblige both parties in a contract to help each other? Well, the notion for Rousseau is that why would the body politic intentionally attack itself? Why would it harm itself? Because it's not in the better interest of both the individuals and the body politic in general. So duty and interest must oblige the two contracting parties, which would be the democratically elected government and its citizens and or subjects, to work with each other, to help each other. And these same individuals should combine in that dual capacity to all the advantages that they have. Anything that can move this forward to continue to preserve and entrench life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness and equality and so on, those things should be good because it benefits both parties, benefits both the government with happy citizens and the citizens themselves. So, since a government was formed by the general will of the citizens, this is what we want to do. The former could not hold any interest contrary to the latter. So the general will should never be counterintuitive. It should never move against the general desires of the body politic. And again, one last time with the pandemic, the Freedom Convoy we had a couple of months ago. You're probably watching this a little bit later, but in February of this year, when polls were taken across Canada regarding the Freedom Convoy, something like 78 to 80 something % of the population thought it was wrong. So as much as we have a group of people that are carrying on about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, the general will was not on their side. The general will in Canada was that, no, we know what we need to do. We are reasonable individuals, and we will continue to mask and get our vaccinations because it is a public health crisis. It's not a freedom crisis. But some individuals wish to look at it that way. So what Rousseau is saying really mattered and continues to matter even today, because anything that goes against the general will should not be something that should be held as a positive thing, because both of those things are going to go in opposite directions. So the general will for most people was that, yes, it is inconvenient. I don't want to wear a mask for much longer, but it's something I have to do. Because at the very least, my degree of self-preservation is that, yeah, I should wear a mask. Because at the very least, I will protect myself. And secondarily, I'm going to protect others. But mostly it's going to be for me. So the general will moved in that direction, other than, it's all about freedom and impinging this and that and repeal all the mandates. It's a public health crisis. It's not a freedom crisis. No one is saying this is permanent. Anyway, I digress too much here. So, sovereign powers do not need to give a guarantee to its subjects because it would be impossible for the body to wish to harm all of its own members. So Rousseau is saying that any action that is counterintuitive, that would lose all of those natural rights in the state of nature, if they're gone and they're counterproductive, that's not a good thing. So the end result is what we see here. We have got Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau. Man is Hobbes, evil. Locke, good. Rousseau, good. Society screwed us up. We need to fix that. Government is Hobbes, needed to protect the public. Locke wanted to benefit public, and Rousseau needed to enforce a social contract. And on it goes. So this little panel here really very quickly gives us an overview of the three people that we've looked at. And again, power should be Hobbes, not shared. The executive is absolute. The monarchy is absolute. Locke, on the other hand, says no, power should be shared. The legislative, the judicial, the executive, all of these different branches of government should work together, and one cannot gang up on the other. And that's in fact the American model that's still in place, is the one that Locke presented. That power should be shared between these different departments so that not one single entity can overpower the other. And Rousseau said, yes, it should be shared, but we need direct representation. Now, the last time direct representation was around was in ancient Greece. So that is going back quite some time. We cannot have direct democracy anymore because there are literally too many people that live in a community. So we have a democratically elected representative. We have a person that represents a particular community or a part of a city or a neighborhood of some sort, and they do the talking for us. But again, whatever talking they do, it needs to be something that is beneficial to that society. Okay, so that is a social contract. The three main characters, Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau. Quite a bit of overlap between Locke and Rousseau, not so much with Hobbes, but all three of them still believe in capital punishment and punishment by death for capital offenses. And Locke and Rousseau, regardless of that position, still wish to make sure that the body politic and the general will is one that matches up. The two of them work and basically march hand in hand, because any law that goes against the natural rights that we have as individuals are bad laws. Okay, so that's it. We're going to see each other next week again for Module 7, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.